My name is Brian Owino. I work at Microsoft Consulting as manager in climate change unit. And today we will have this session, which is part of our CRAG webinar um, that will be touching on climate change. And we'll be looking at the effectiveness of the ways in which we can enhance climate financing for locally led adaptations in Africa. And we have with us our panelists who are experts in the field. They've been doing a great work in advancing climate adaptation to the local communities that are mostly underserved and mostly affected by the impacts of climate change. Just before I will introduce the panelists later, but then I would like to invite my colleague Pranav, who would give us a brief introduction to the concept of ALA, as well as why it matters to our local communities in Africa and the people around the world. Welcome, Pranav, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brian. And hi, everyone. Welcome all to this webinar. We're going to focus on the locally led adaptation, but specifically the financing that is required to enable it. I'm going to speak about why locally led adaptation is important to us in this context, why we are speaking about it today. I'm sure eminent panelists are going to speak in detail about the questions that we posed to them. So I'll take you through very quickly at a very high level about why LLA itself is important and why we're discussing this today, especially in the context of Africa. As a quick way of introduction, my name is Pranav. I lead the climate and sustainability practice in Africa for Microsoft Consulting. All right, I'm hoping my screen is visible to everyone. So to start with, I'm going to talk about locally led adaptation itself and the principles that govern it, how it is different, how we have arrived at this. In fact, we have members from GCA and IIED who are the front runners in this, who are the who have been the one who sort of brought this front and center for all the development sector partners to adopt the principles of LLA. So there are various definitions around LLA, and I'll be referring to that as LLA mostly going in this discussion. The idea is eventually to think of locally led adaptation as a continuum of a program delivery approach, that on one hand, you have something like basically a locally implemented project where the beneficiaries are passive recipients of the intended benefits of the project. Whether or not that actually accrues is often contentious, and that's on one spectrum. To some degrees, programs have tried to involve people in some sort of in some sort of management role, but the actual decision making still lies with the organizations or agencies who are financing these programs. And then at the other end of the spectrum, where we have arrived now, or hopefully we are going to sort of mainstream this going forward, is locally led adaptation. So this requires not just this is truly democratic in the way that the communities that are facing the brunt of climate change, that have a need to adapt, have the ownership of the financing, but also have the whole soul decision making. And this is very essential when we talk about adaptation, given its very specific characteristics that we can talk about later. In terms of why LLA, beyond the idea of climate and justice itself, where people should be involved in, they should have the agency of decision making on things that affect their lives so deeply, LLA has been found out to be efficient and effective, right? So we have seen that households have been adapting to climate over a period of time. Climate introduces new risks, but it also exacerbates existing risks. And to that end, households have been doing this even before the development practitioners might have identified this as a need. And that indicates for us why they should continue playing a role in the decisions of what is their specific context and what are the steps that they need to take. Adaptation itself is very contextual. It depends from place to place. It varies for households to households, depending on their socioeconomic characteristics, geography, their livelihoods, and so on. And that sort of contextualized problem solving cannot happen in a very centralized manner. And given that characteristic of adaptation itself, a locally led approach is likely to be way more effective. At the end of it is obviously the idea of equity. So when people are in charge of their own lives, they're often able to take the decisions that for them make sense. And the idea here is to be as inclusive as possible. Simply involving people doesn't ensure a locally led adaptation approach. And that's why we have the principles, the 8 principles that the Global Commission on Adaptation brought out. And it is now increasingly subscribed by various important institutions, government and non-governmental organizations who are working on this. IED is one amongst those 120 plus government agencies and non-governmental agencies that have subscribed to this. What are these 8 principles and why do we need those? So I'll start here. We're going to talk clockwise, starting from devolving decision making. So as the name suggests, one of the most important aspect is just ensuring that decision making translates to people who stand to benefit or get affected by the program. So that's a fundamental requirement or characteristic of LLA. Beyond this, of course, simply, as I mentioned, simply including people or simply working with community would not achieve these ends, would not be truly inclusive unless we solve for some of the structural inequalities. So whether it is women, PWDs, or marginalized communities, or the indigenous populations who traditionally have not had seat at the table where the decisions are being taken, it's important to make sure all of these populations and peoples are included in the decision making. One of the very fundamental reason why this is important is because climate and its risks can affect people differently. And so people can have different problems and different needs. And those need to be accounted for in a well thought out program. That's where the concept of inclusivity comes, in addition to the idea of climate justice itself. Now, when we compare traditional programs in the way they were designed, there was obviously a very huge need felt for accountability, which used to translate in the way of M&E monitoring and evaluation framework and a need for results and reporting. And as much as some of those elements are important, and we'll talk about that under accountability, there is a need to provide more patient and predictable funding. And we have observed that very often it has happened that in the past, organizations, international development organizations may have come in with good intent, but a need to see early results can lead to programs structured in a way that don't truly meet the need. And that's why having this patient capital is important. The patient capital is important also because if there's flexibility in the programming, that's another point, characteristic of LLA. And if there's learning to be had, it requires time and iteration. And the funding that is provided has to be assured and has to be reliable over a longer period of time. That's also typical of the solutions that work for adaptation. Adaptation is something that requires us to understand it, but also it's the problem itself of climate itself is changing, and therefore the needs might themselves evolve. So what may be applicable in year 1 and 2 may not be so relevant in year 5 and 6, depending on how the things unfold. And that capital allows us to learn and construct systems that are resilient over a longer period of time. Of course, this necessitates a local investment in local capacities, whether through institutions or whether through capacity building for individuals involved in the design, because it's not just sufficient to understand what the current challenges are. It's also important to understand what are the possible opportunities that can be that they provide. So climate change is not just adverse effects; adaptation may offer opportunities to improve the current situation. And those require awareness and understanding of the menu of different solutions that exist, and that requires investment in local capabilities. It is also important from the point of view of sustainability of the program, because investing in local institutions mean even as the program is withdrawn or matures, the local capacities exist and the program can continue housed within the local communities. Then we talk about the importance of understanding climate risk and uncertainty, and this is not very different from capacities. So there is an idea of understanding what drives the changes that people are seeing in their lives, but there are also some tricky aspects to this. Risks and uncertainties are principles that are not intuitive to humans, and so we understand when it comes to probabilities of events that happen at the tail of the the distribution, there's likely that we are not able to comprehend the potential impact it has or what is the true occurrence of an event. And this requires a more rigorous approach, a more methodical approach, which is something that needs to be institutionalized within the program itself. As I mentioned earlier, there's a need for adapting within the adaptation programs itself. The effects of climate change gradually or suddenly over a period of time. Some solutions that might work today may not work tomorrow because of certain hard limits that we will achieve based on worsening climate indicators. And so it's important to continuously update our understandings of things. Again, this feeds back into the reason we need to have patient capital and long-term durations of program. Transparency and accountability is important because very often, as in any financing project, any project which requires financing, we need to make sure that as much as there is flexibility in learning, there is the finance is being used as intended. And so that sort of, and we will talk more about how digital financial services can play a role here in today's webinar about this. And finally, at the essence of all of this is collaboration across communities, the scientific community, and other value chain players who can come together to enable locally led adaptation. Why LLA? Why are we talking about this? Why does it matter in the context of Africa? It matters in the context of the globe as such, but why especially Africa? And I think I would just like to draw your attention to this one fact. The 10 most vulnerable countries with respect to climate change are all African countries. And if that alone doesn't sort of motivate us to take this seriously, I don't know what will. So we have to understand that there is increasing risks accrued over a period of time. And given most of the countries we work in, the existing socioeconomic vulnerabilities that exacerbate the problems, there is a need to sort of build that resilience now within the communities. We have talked about how LLA is efficient and is effective and is equitable, and those are necessary for the most vulnerable populations within these communities that we are focusing on. And finally, it should not be any surprise that the principles of financing locally led adaptation are not much different from principles behind locally led adaptation itself. So as we spoke about transparency and accountability, as we spoke about inclusivity, we talked about giving the agency to the communities which are affected, and we talked about flexibility and learning within the programs. And those are some of the four principles, some of the key principles or characteristics of financing for locally led adaptation. Hopefully in today's webinar, we'll speak more about LLA and why it's important, but we'll talk specifically about how digital financial systems can actually enable and catapult this, accelerate the financing of locally led adaptation, specifically because a lot of the countries we focus on have witnessed a surprisingly good amount of inclusion when it comes catalyzed through the digital financial services. So we want to focus on now how that can be leveraged to enable locally led adaptation. Thank you very much. Over to you, Brian.
Thank you very much, Pranav, for giving a quick overview on the concept as well as the context of LLA. I believe that this has given an understanding to different persons or different experts who not necessarily are within the space of environment to have an understanding of how LLA is important in Africa and how LLA is important to the globe as well. In the next steps, I will now move to the section of where we'll have a brief discussion about the core theme of this webinar today, which is financing. But before I move to that, I will introduce my co-host, who is Phenny, just to introduce herself. And we are hosting this webinar together with Africa Leadership Academy. You can see Nono is attending the call. Thank you. Phenny, to you briefly before I introduce the guests.
Great. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Phenny Omondi. I'm a member of ALforAgribusiness Network and also the Director of Agricultural Recovery Hub here, based here in Nairobi. I work with the Global Food Banking Network. Really excited to be here to learn and contribute. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So moving to introduce our speakers or our panelists today, we were greatly privileged to host Tracy Kajumba and Anju Sharma. Tracy is the director at International. Tracy is the director for the program which is known as the Least Developed Countries Initiative for Effective Adaptation and Resilience, LifeAir. She'll talk more about it in the course of this discussion. Her expertise ranges technical and strategic advice to support the least developed countries. And she's responsible for catalyzing and scaling up and delivering, adaptation programs in this program. She is stewarding and, the overall progress of this program, including technical assistance to connect these countries and different partners, including expertise, building global connections, and working with governments, international partners, and academia, as well as technical expertise such as those attending this call, civil society, and grassroots organizations. Welcome, Tracy, and we're happy to host you. Our second panelist would be Anju Sharma, who is the global lead for locally led climate adaptation at Global Center on Adaptation. Anju is a manager and a researcher as well as a writer, global understanding as well as local context on the matters of sustainable development in developing countries. She's worked over 20 years and she's committed to promote implementing different sustainable development actions to address poverty within the local and global context. Welcome, Anju. Welcome, Tracy. And with the first question, you'll briefly maybe introduce yourselves if I've missed something, and just cite probably in a minute or so how GCA as well as IIED is tackling the component of LLA in your work.
Thank you, Brian. I think you've introduced me. There's nothing more to add. That was a lot. I work with IIED, and as you all know, IIED provided thought leadership to the LLA principles, informed by the long-term work we've done on climate finance through decentralized climate finance models in a number of African countries. And also another program we had, Money Where It Matters, ensuring that finance gets to the very local level. And at the moment, LLA works closely with the GCA on taking forward LLA approaches through accountability, peer learning, good partnerships, and others. But to briefly talk about LifeAir, LifeAir is a least developed countries initiative on effective adaptation and resilience. Very transformational. It is led by the LDC group itself, with the LDC chair at the helm of it. IIED provides interim secretariat for it, but we are transitioning in the next 2 years to a fully LDC-led facility. And the purposes really align with the topic of this webinar. It's about LDCs recognizing that climate finance is not working for them and moving to challenging power dynamics within the system to move towards long-term programming, predictable and accessible financing, working on principles of equity, but also building systems and capabilities of the LDCs to be able to access finance. And we very much aligned with the locally led adaptation principles, with a commitment that 70% of all the climate adaptation funding that comes into the initiative is invested behind community priorities. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Anju?
Thanks, Brian, and thanks also for inviting me today to speak on this really important topic. So, Brian, as you mentioned, I work with the Global Center on Adaptation, and Pranav had mentioned the Global Commission on Adaptation, which the center was set up to deliver on the mandate of that commission, right? And that was where this really important need for locally led adaptation was identified. So LLA currently runs across our program areas, which are the other areas that were defined by the Commission as key for climate change. And also we have, at the request of the Bangladesh government, we've set up a global hub on locally led adaptation based out of our regional office in Dhaka. So I'll describe later, I think, the activities that we do. One of them is very much sort of, well, it's first of all, the recognition that over the years, we've spent a lot of time and effort building the capacity of international and national organizations, even to some extent, right? But we've completely ignored the capacity of local organizations and of communities to be able to work together, to have opportunities for peer-to-peer learning, etc. So along with climate finance, we're also sort of providing that kind of opportunity for peer-to-peer learning through the Global Hub. And I'll sort of describe in detail how we try to overcome this problem of the scale of finance that we really need for locally led adaptation, right? That's something that comes up in any meeting. It doesn't need to be a meeting that's focused on finance, but invariably the conversation turns to, look, there's all this work that communities are doing because they have no option, because it's not, you can't choose whether to adapt or not. You have to adapt. But you don't get the money. So that's sort of the big message that's come out from the publications we put out in the past years, that communities are doing a lot of work, but they're not getting the resources that they need. So as I said, I'll come to the activities of the Global Hub and how the Global Center on Adaptation works on trying to scale up finance for locally led adaptation, perhaps in answer to your questions. But thanks again for inviting me.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Those are very great insights on how the work you're doing in ALLA, as well as advancing financing. We had our third speaker as well, Joanes Atela, who was not able to join us, but then he sent a representative. Leah, probably if you'd want to introduce yourself and also speak about the work you're doing at Africa Research and Impact Network. Welcome, Leah.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me. It's been a very eventful few days here in Kenya. My name is Leah Awoko from the Africa Research and Impact Network. Relaying apologies from Dr. Atela. He's held up in another meeting, but really happy to contribute to the discussion. The Africa Research and Impact Network is a network of scholars, so early career researchers working on diverse issues, amongst which is locally led adaptation. Currently, I'm the project coordinator for the locally led adaptation metrics in Africa, that we just want to scope out bottom-up metrics from the vulnerable communities in the Lake region in Kenya and see how this compares to national and county priorities. So we really want the involvement of the local communities in ensuring that adaptation is needs-driven and not just because there is availability of funds, etc. We are also looking at how this dynamically intersects with climate financing and adaptation financing, to be specific. So I'm really excited about this discussion and happy to extrapolate more on some of our preliminary observations and findings in regard to the same. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. These are very insightful. And again, just to build up on that, my first question probably to you, Anju, in terms of what you do at the Hub, why is financing so important in the work of the Hub, and why should private sector as well as different financial institutions care about this?
So, Brian, basically, as I said, GCA was set up in 2018, right? And one of the big questions for us was that there isn't an international organization on adaptation yet, but there are many organizations that are working on adaptation already. So what is the added value that we can bring without necessarily sort of replicating what others are already doing? And so in the case of locally led adaptation, which, as I said, is a critical area across our programs, it was clear that the problem is that there are fantastic initiatives on the ground, but scale, well, if scale is their ambition, but in any case, finance is one of the big issues, that you're not able to link up these good initiatives with large quantities of finance, because I mean, everybody seems to have the impression somehow that it's only big infrastructure projects, etc., that are big bang projects that are worth sort of, writing proposals to the Green Climate Fund, etc., for. So what we were trying to do is that how do you link up these initiatives with global funding, the big sources of funding that exist currently? And one of the ways in which we work is our initiative called the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program. So our first program area of focus, so to speak, was Africa, because that was identified by our board as one of the key vulnerable areas. And so it was we started with the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program. And essentially what that was a partnership with the IFIs, with first the African Development Bank, then the World Bank, then with other banks that work in Africa, to say that, because one of the key problems was how do you integrate adaptation into development, right, into development planning? So what we did in Africa and continue to do is provide the technical support needed to embed these adaptation approaches into early project design. So we have what we call an upstream financing facility, and we support the design of these projects to be inclusive of adaptation. What does that mean for locally led adaptation, right? One of the gaps we found was that these IFIs, when they design projects, what they really struggle to do well is to have any meaningful engagement with communities. We've been trying to do that for a long time. We've moved on. It usually ends up being some sort of community participation rather than leadership, right? That you have a consultant that goes in there and talks to the community, and then that passes off as community engagement. So what we said to them is, look, we identify ourselves as solution brokers, but there are people within those communities who work with the community, know the community well, have a relationship, understand the social, political context much better than any of us ever will. So what we will do is sort of support organizations like that to have access to best practice on how to engage communities, how to support communities to understand what climate change means to them, right? You can't just parachute into a community and start talking about climate change because they've not had the chance to really map what it means for their lives, for their livelihoods, for their housing, etc. So to support that kind of process where they get access to information on how the climate is going to change, that they're able to understand their context. So many of these are very data poor environments, right? For instance, informal settlements, hardly any data exists. How many people live there? What kind of access do they have to public services? What are their water needs? How does flooding affect them? What's the problem with their housing, etc.? So essentially what we support is a process for the community by themselves to collect data. So we train community mobilizers, we team up with local universities, we train community mobilizers. They have, these questionnaires, and this borrows very heavily from the Slum Dwellers International's methodologies. They've been doing this for years. They know how this works. So they've developed a methodology which is called profiling and enumeration, right? And sometimes that even involves giving house numbers because these houses are not numbered. But basically, facilitating the community to go through a process of data collection, then provide support for analysis, bring that back to the community, and give them that chance for iterative planning to understand that, okay, there's climate change, right? What do we want to do with it? We are a community. Different people have different priorities. How do we negotiate those priorities as a community, right? How do we come together with a plan that we can all put our weight behind? And in all of this, our inspiration was the work that happened in Mukuru. So I put a link to our global hub on LLA on the website, but the work that happened in Mukuru was really inspirational because it was completely community-led, right? So it was a community in Mukuru that kind of took what SDI had been doing in other places and took it to another level. Also primarily because Kenya had this new constitution, which, gave the mandate to the local government to work with the communities. And that's what the Nairobi County Council did. They sort of the heads of each of the departments of key sectors that the community identified as areas that they wanted to work on. The departments led the NGOs that worked in Mukuru came together, not doing fragmented action anymore, but pushing in one direction. There was multi-sectoral sort of discussions on how the sectors interlapped, because, for instance, you can't do flood management without looking at waste management, right? I mean, when you're building roads and when you're building sanitation services, etc., you need all of that to go together. So they built the platforms to have this kind of intersectoral discussion. So all of that, the government leadership, that really good partnership with communities where they felt in charge, and the data that these communities that come out with, that belongs to them and it empowers them. It was fantastic because now they could speak to governments and, you know, not be countered back. They had the data to prove what they were saying, and that was incredibly empowering. So what we do is essentially take this and bring it to the context of the IFI investments. So for instance, just to give you a short example before I stop, but in Liberia, the World Bank was designing a program on urban resilience. And we said to them, you know, 70% of the population in Monrovia lives in informal settlements. How are you going to take on board the priorities of those communities? And essentially what we did was worked with SDI's partner, brought on the groups that had worked in Mukuru to be the sort of peer-to-peer, for that kind of peer-to-peer learning to take place, bring in board SDI and local universities to do the kind of, you know, data crunching that was needed, provide the information to the communities. They will then come up with what we now call people's adaptation plans, and these people's adaptation plans will then inform investments under this Liberia Urban Resilience Program. So essentially what we are trying to do is to link up locally led planning processes to what you may call conventional sources of funding. And we understand that if it's, you know, a process led by the communities, there may be that the priorities of the, whatever World Bank or AFDB don't entirely match those of the communities. But what we are left with is a people's adaptation plan, which in the future should become the basis for other people to invest in, right? So development partners, bilateral partners shouldn't have to sort of dream up projects out of thin air, but they have this basis where the communities have come up with a multi-sectoral plan. They have identified specific investments that need to be made. And so these can become the basis for which those investments are then targeted towards what the communities need. So in brief, that's what the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program does. And the Global Hub supports through the whole sort of capacity building, peer-to-peer learning that I said. So they came to Mukuru, the Mukuru community went to Liberia. So we're also trying to set up those kind of connections and cross-learning, even in Asia. So I'll stop there, but happy to come back with more detail later.
Okay, well, thank you. That is very insightful and some practical examples of how, you are the different programs and the process of how you're engaging local, communities in the process, developing people adaptation plans. And this is really good to lead to the second questions, which probably, what Tracy touched on. What could be the possible, or what are some of the effective financial instruments or methods in which these funds and these resources can be deployed to, local communities?
So thank you for this question, Brian. I'll start with a caveat that financing is the major issue that comes up in everything we talk about. And for LLA, yes, financing is important, but it's not the only one. I need to emphasize that. And I think we need to learn from the localization and the grand bargain agenda as we tackle LLA so that we don't get it wrong. It's about many other things in addition to financing. I thought I should say that, so as much as we're talking about financing. So to put it in the context of the LDC group and linking to what we are doing, we know that LDCs have been accessing funding, bilateral, multilateral, from MDBs, GCF, LDCF, and others. But still, to tackle LLA, I think we need to look at the root causes, the problems, the systemic issues around financing before we go to what is the best financing, because the problems are there. There's nothing that is best when it comes to financing. It's always a battle even when we go for the UNFCCC negotiations. So unless we tackle the barriers and the systemic challenges of financing, we will not get financing into LLA. So we need to tackle them together. What are the barriers? Identify them, continue influencing and addressing the power dynamics, and then channeling it to LLA. Because LLA, just as having the principles and trying to implement them, will not help us solve the immediate problems. So despite all the financing mechanisms, LifeAR, the LDC group, identified that yes, financing is available, but the way we work is usually business as usual, top-led priorities. And climate action is not driven by those that are impacted, the LDCs, the local communities. Most of the time we are responding to externally driven top-down approaches, which result in failed adaptation approaches. But also on the institutional side of communities, governments, there's the need to build systems, structures, capabilities to be able to access and use financing in ways that will build adaptation. So there's need for really a historical shift on how the financing mechanisms work. And the financing is short-term, it's unpredictable, it's insufficient. Most of the mechanisms like the banks and others take a low-risk approach. We know the problem of debt is one of the biggest on the African continent. And the studies that IIED did that informed LLA principles, it's quite a bit old now. Of the adaptation funding to the LDCs, only 18% was reaching the LDC countries, and only 10% was reaching the local level. So the intermediation of fund management through agencies that are accredited and the support to other national needs, then only 10% gets to the local level. And that definitely does not address LLA and get communities involved. That's why we've set a target of 70% going behind community investments. So these are all systems that need to be addressed for the flows to really address LLA and focus on a long-term programming approach than the short-term approach, and making sure that the right groups are involved. So when you look at the financing instruments and the different providers of finance, there are challenges definitely. When we talk of GCF, Jeff, my God, when we started this initiative 5 years ago, only 5 LDC institutions were accredited. Either you had to go through a UN agency or another institution, so the LDC governments could not access funding directly. And that's why this initiative was started. Can we do something that we can lead on our own and get financing into it and demonstrate that if there's direct access to finance, it is likely to shift how locally led adaptation actually works on the ground when governments have full control. So it's a proof of concept. It's very challenging, but very interesting to see how this works. And we're already seeing lots of changes. We've not focused on finance initially. We've focused on strengthening LDC systems and capabilities. We've focused on a whole of government approach. How do you bring in ministries of finance and energy and others, instead of looking at financing energy or agriculture because the donor wants to do that? We are looking at how to bring the whole of government together, looking at climate policies and priorities. And then we go to the community. We do context-specific climate risk assessments. We have a delivery mechanism designed so that investments then are responding to the adaptation options that have been agreed and identified by the community, informed by the climate risks that they want to address. So that is the approach we're taking. And we're hoping that these lessons will inform GCF and other providers to learn lessons on how do you become flexible in the way financing gets to the LDCs, other than being prescriptive and telling them what to do, which at the end of the day does not work. So when you look at other instruments, there are instruments, of course, you said which ones are good. Grants definitely will be good because they don't require financial returns. They are conducive to action on social benefits, but still there are challenges that we still need to use these lessons to challenge. For grants, targeting has been a problem, especially inclusion of groups that are likely to be excluded, like women not receiving these grants because either you're recognizing male-headed households or they are not in organizations that have all the required documentation to be able to access this funding. So there are always these barriers that we really need to talk about. If you look at equity finance, it would be good and valuable at the early start for those that don't have capital for climate investment. But then you also find a challenge that in Africa, for example, 23% of the SMEs are owned by women, but you also find there's that big financing gap in terms of how do they access finance? How do women-owned businesses access finance? There's need for security and all that. So there are all those barriers that we still need to tackle, and also look at the domestic mechanisms like effective PMF systems that can also support countries to plan and program better to be able to access the funding. There's the challenge of loans where adaptation funding comes in form of loans, or they are saying they are concessional small percentage, still a loan, and you'll find the country still grappling with other bigger loans, and then we're getting a loan for adaptation. How does that work? How does that support locally led adaptation? So there's a lot of work that we need to do out of the examples we get out of adaptation implementation, but we need a reform. We need to continue challenging power dynamics that are really affecting the developing countries to deliver on LLA and effective adaptation. So I'll stop here for now.
Thank you very much. This is very insightful, giving the actual, quantitative values in terms of how finance is flowing to, to the local communities as well as different programs. And just mentioning that 10% is getting to the local, LLA programs. And Anju was also mentioning some of these programs and how they link to multinational financial institutions. And this takes me to, the third question, which probably, given that Leah is working a lot on locally led adaptation metrics and enhancing the effectiveness. From the perspectives of local communities, or from the perspectives of the stakeholders that you've worked with, Leah, what are the barriers? What is the challenge? Why is climate finance not reaching them? What are some of the barriers, and how can this be addressed?
All right. Thanks, Brian. Just confirm that you can hear me.
Yes,
yeah,
sure.
Thank you. So as I mentioned before, right now the Africa Research and Impact Network is coordinating a locally led adaptation program dubbed LAMA, that is Locally Led Adaptation Metrics for Africa. And we are basically working in 14 LREB countries, that is the Lake Basin region, counties in Kenya. And one of the things that perhaps we have preliminarily observed is a disconnect in the ways in which financing is allocated to adaptation interventions. So for example, as I mentioned, what we are doing right now with the local communities is scoping out their priorities and metrics in terms of adaptation interventions that are being implemented by private sector, NGOs, CBOs, the county government, international organizations, etc. And some of the communities in the Lake Basin region are saying, okay, fine, they dug a borehole, but what we really needed them to do was to maybe strengthen our capacity in growing drought-resistant crops, for example, or strengthening our capacity to find other forms of livelihoods. And there's a bit of disconnect in that sense. So when you find a very useful program such as FLOCA, perhaps some of us have known about it, the Financing Locally Led Climate Action, which is a 5-year government program jointly funded by the World Bank and the Kenyan government, trickling down to the county level and being implemented by I think it's the county ward climate change planning committees, right? And so how are they allocating these financing mechanisms? One of the structural barriers we've had is in terms of bureaucracy. You find 90% or 80% or even 70% going to meetings, high-level stakeholder meetings, high-level engagements, but only 10% or so reaching the local community. It tells you that there is a problem. When you're allocating these funding mechanisms, a lot of it remains at the top level. And so what we really want to do in complementing the FLOCA program that is being jointly run by the Kenyan government and the World Bank is to provide bottom-up approach towards adaptation intervention and adaptation financing, because what we are observing is that when communities take charge and when they take leadership and ownership, even the local governments are more willing, let me say very loosely, to support needs-driven adaptation intervention. So they are able to listen to the voices of the community. Right now, we may not be able to really analyze the efficacy of these climate change committees, but just preliminarily to say that they feel this is they've taken ownership of the for example, the FLOCA program, but they really want it. They want the financing to go towards interventions that are meeting their needs, and not just their needs as men or women. There are also persons with disabilities. We've interacted with child-headed households, and part of our extensive work is looking at how these marginalized groups within society can also benefit, because when you think of a flood, for example, in an area, and you think about a person who is living with disability, how is this person's resilience enhanced in such a scenario? We normally think about the people like you and me, but there are other vulnerable groups within society who make up part of the community and who we should look into, their welfare and how they're adapting, how their resilience can be enhanced. So this is where we want the money to go to, in short. But of course, barriers such as, bureaucracy, corruption, misappropriation of funds that have routinely dogged our financial system stand as steady hindrances when you want the local community to directly benefit. Another aspect that we're really working on, and which we have preliminarily observed, is people thinking from an individual point of view. So what can Leah benefit from this program? Let's say the FLOCA program, or you're interviewing me on Llama. So how am I personally going to benefit? We are sort of moving their mindset or shifting their mindset to think as a community group. So as women, how can we benefit as persons living with disabilities? We have widows amongst us. How are they resilient towards the impact of climate change? As men, as the elderly, how are they resilient? How is the youth groups, how are they being resilient? And having that mind shift is really useful, because studies have shown that then people are able to innovatively even come up with locally led financing mechanisms, which may not even be in the form of cash, but even that ability, skills, growing their skills, strengthening their capacity, coming up with great ideas, agriculture smart ideas, or alternative livelihoods that can really enhance the resilience of a community, has proven to be useful. So we want to leverage, or want to strengthen their capacity and leverage on that community thinking, and shifting their mindset from an individual point of benefit to how can we collectively make this work for us, so that when someone is thinking about this program that is being funded from the national government and the World Bank, and coming to the local communities, they're able to see these are the practical steps that we can take to make all our lives better, to make all of us more resilient. So yeah, that is the value add, I can say, that we are looking at when we're thinking about Llama and FLOCA, that is the financing mechanism, and how both can usefully feed into each other for greater gain. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. That's very insightful, and it's very, what I'm understanding is that we are having different insights from global level, how the finance is flowing from the multinational organizations, as well as the different segments of the populations that are highly vulnerable, and how this can be bridged together. So these are really great insights, and I believe we are taking notes. And to the audience, you can start posting. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box, and then we'll present them to the to the panelists. If you have very specific questions or something to understand as well. Yeah. Now moving forward, having this conversation around the financial instruments as well as the finance flow to different countries as well as different populations. And as MEC, we focus a lot on how we can drive financing and what is the role of digital, the digital resources that we have, the digital instruments. And this is really something we'd like to understand, even to the broader audience, to give a clear understanding of how digital platforms, what role can they play to drive this effectiveness. Probably to start with you, Tracy, how can we blend in, digital solutions to drive these financial components so that when a shock happens, when a climate shock happens, that vulnerable household can get that level of support in order to cope or to adapt or to build their resilience?
Climate information is one of the things that will help address the climate challenges if communities were getting information. And from previous work we've done, that is really a big challenge where meteorology agencies have information that could be useful for early warning, but getting it to the communities sometimes is really difficult and could save lives if that happened. So there are tools, digital tools that are really useful for early warning, risk management, but also in terms of adaptation planning, community-based risk screening to help improve adaptation programs is one of those that are effective and also contribute to value for money. There are other platforms like mobile money that have really been useful in terms of getting finances to the local level, either through social protection systems or cash for work. Those digital platforms have also been useful. But also in terms of financing, we need to monitor and track the funding and make sure it's effective. So some of the tools like the budget monitoring web platforms have also been used in some of the governments and have been really effective in terms of monitoring program performance and impact of the programs that are being implemented. And of recent, of course, big data, artificial intelligence is also coming in to inform some of these systems and information gaps, which are also really useful. In LifeAR, we work with governments, but we aim to get money directly to the local level, which is really, really challenging. And we talk about fund management, but it's still important sometimes. So sometimes fund managers at local levels are also important, using different systems of getting money to the local level, but also being aware of issues of accountability and transparency on how this is supposed to work. But we also need to be cautious as well in terms of access and connectivity, which remain a big barrier, especially in Africa. The digital divide, both at regional and global scales, can be challenging. So there's need also to look at who is able to use that digital information and who is not yet. We did a study with the World Bank, and one of the findings in Sierra Leone, for example, 3% of the population has access to mobile phones, but half of them cannot connect to the internet, and a quarter of them require assistance to use WhatsApp, especially old people and women. Some of them can't send messages or use social media. So the platforms might be available, but the question is, how are they applicable so that different categories of people, especially in context of LLA, in terms of issues of education, gender divide, and education. All those are challenges that we need to look at, though they provide a very good opportunity, especially with young people in terms of getting information to the local level. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you. That's very insightful. Actually, that brings me to a point of just calling back on the people adaptation plan, and Anju was emphasizing on on how different programs were designed with people at the center of it. In Mukuru, for example, and Liberia, and just to bring an understanding of whether and how digital solutions, for example, how digital finance can take part in this. Has this been put in, is there a use case that we can borrow from this, Anju, especially from this mentioning data collection process? How is this featuring in these programs that you designed together with the people of Mukuru and Liberia, or not any other example that probably you can highlight to bring an understanding of how tech can play a role in this?
Yeah, Brian. So in the context of the people's adaptation plans, I mean, the main sort of digital I wouldn't say solution, but basically tool that we use is GIS, because that's fantastic for communities to understand, right? I mean, and not just, you know, within one informal settlement, but often in areas where there are conflict between communities. These kind of maps are incredibly useful tools to for communities to be able to visualize what the challenge is and what kind of solutions that they can come up with. And as I said, we work with universities, the local university that exists. So, you know, for instance, we're just starting work in Homa Bay County. So there's the Tom Mboya University, I think. So we'll be working with them and sort of trying to build that capacity within the university to support communities to be able to use GIS for this kind of planning, right? But in the context of sort of using digital tools for financing, I think they have a really critical role to play, right? And I'll give you one example. It wasn't originally a climate solution, but adaptation was kind of retrofitted into it, which was something called a National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme run in India. It's one of the world's biggest social protection programs. And what it essentially is, it kind of recognizes that in parts of India, there are periods of the year where rural communities have absolutely no employment, because it's the lean season for agriculture, you know, so they're extremely vulnerable then. So what it initially was a way of providing 100 days of guaranteed employment to these communities. So it was a plan, and a huge amount of money, literally the world's biggest social protection program, funds were going to the rural level. And you can imagine that in the beginning, the kind of corruption that went on there, right? So there were people sort of who had passed away getting money, people who didn't exist getting money, and all of that. And the way they were able to solve that was through digital solutions, which have like only just gotten better and better. You have blockchain and all of this, which can really make sure that the recipient is indeed the person who's the intended recipient, right? But like, I think it's not just the digital solutions that solve the problem, but it's also sort of the human and the institutional and programmatic solutions that need to go with it, right? So particularly in the context of climate change, the time that communities are most vulnerable in the context of sort of sudden onset shocks, like, you know, whether it's a drought or a flood or something like that, is immediately after. So if you can't assist them then the likelihood is that the impacts are going to last for even decades, because they have to sell off important assets, they have to withdraw children from education, the nutritional needs are not met, so they can really have impacts for a long time to come. So we need systems that are really responsive. So it's having that digital way of sort of transferring money, taking into account the kind of challenges that Tracy was talking about, that these digital systems are not accessible by everybody, but also being able to do it in a way that it's as localized as possible. So IIED, for instance, has done a lot of work on these funds that are locally based that can then respond in this way, whether they are disaster management funds or whether they are specifically climate change funds. But you need these kind of funds existing where local, actors can make quick decisions on when this kind of urgent response is needed after a crisis takes place, right? And often that can also be banks through insurance and things like that. So we really do need to bring in local banks that currently are not part of the picture. So I think that digital solutions are critical in trying to solve some of the problems that we've not been able to solve for many, many years, like this whole question of accountability and transparency and who gets how much money and for what, etc. But it needs to be accompanied by sort of equally solid human systems. So you'd still need those kind of ombudsman organizations where people can go and complain that I was meant to get this money for this reason and I didn't, and all of that, right? So and it is remarkable how quickly they catch on. I think COVID was one of those accelerators where, and at great pain to poor communities, right? So when that change took place in India, for instance, there were people who were paid salaries in cash and they spent and saved in cash, right? So they didn't have banks, they didn't have access to these digital solutions. And so they really suffered initially. But over time, I think that they can help solve a lot of the problems that we're trying to face if we can make sure that there is access by the poor and vulnerable to these digital solutions.
Okay, thank you. That's very insightful. Just providing how digital solutions have been able to address the gaps between the financial institutions and the communities that need them the most. And just in terms of M&E, which of course is also emphasized as a very important element in addressing the financial needs and tracking whether they are reaching them or not. What are some of the strategies or some of the ways in which monitoring and evaluation can best be designed in order to track the financing, to understand where the barriers are? Probably you can answer that in 2 minutes, Anju, and maybe get some insights from Tracy and also from Leah. Because I know this probably cross-cut your work a lot, M&E as a component in LM.
Yeah, so again, I can give an example from the Narega thing that so when they found that all this money was going where it wasn't meant to go in the early days, I mean, they reacted sensibly. It wasn't let's centralize, let people on the top decide who gets the money, how, etc. But they came up with a fantastic solution, which is they said that every state in India, of the money that they receive for this particular program, 2% has to automatically, it's not up to the government, it's an automatic transfer. 2% goes into setting up what they call social audit and transparency and accountability organizations, right? The job of these organizations was every 6 months, go down to every village, do an accounting, have a village assembly, tell the people, you were meant to get this much for this. You did this job and were meant to be paid this much, were you? And you'd be amazed how effective a system like that is, right? So these social audit systems, and it became so effective that other programs started using it. So I think that at the end of the day, which is also a key LLA principle, it's accountability to communities, right? Not just to the people who are providing the money, which is the way we tend to look at it these days, but it's accountability to the communities. And one way of doing that is making it clear to them how much money there is and what it's going towards and how much they should have. So having these kind of platforms by which they get this information and by which they can question what, who got how much and why. So I mean, it's not a climate change example, but there are many, I think, also in that context.
Thank you. Yes, yeah. Tracy.
Yes, thank you. If I may come in, I think I'll start from a systems approach, kind of, because that affects how accountability happens at the local level. If we're not getting right globally, then definitely even at the local level, it won't happen. So what we're doing in LifeAR, in terms of accountability, as Anju says, when the LDC group set up this initiative, they offered to do particular things and offered donors to do other things to enable them function. So in terms of reporting, we report, the LDCs report, but the donors also report. We have a partnership-based compact. So the donors that fund the initiative are partners. We don't look at them as funders, which is really different. So they also report. So we are not looking at the quality of the quantity of the money, but also the quality, which is part of our mail system. So that's why we've set up a figure, 70% behind community investments. And in the budgets we do, then we track how much is going to the local level. We have not achieved it. We're at 65%, very challenging, because to achieve that, you need a certain amount of funding. The quantity has to be at a certain level to allow other things like mail capacity building to happen while the initiative is also effective. That is one angle we brought our mail system. And the other one we've done is look at tools that are available within ministries of finance, for example, like the climate budget tagging tool. How does that help us to make sure that actually financing is getting to the local level in a decentralized mode and communities are able to access that? We've also moved away from, not really moved away, re-emphasized qualitative methods of MEL than just the quantitative, because we love the numbers, but what is the story behind the numbers? So if we track the quality, the quantity without looking at the quality, LLA principles will not be achieved. So we are introducing tools that are more qualitative, like scorecards, like peer reviews, like impact stories, to really hear what is the change that is happening at community where these funds are being invested. So our mail is designed that way and trying to capture voices of different groups at community level where these investments are happening, so that we're not just looking at the quality of the funding going, the quantity of the funding going to the community, but is it really supporting effective adaptation? Is it flexible? Is it accessible? And is it really reaching those that are supposed to access the funding? So that is part of what we are doing in terms of our metrics for LLA approaches. Yeah, I'll stop for now.
Thank you very much. Leah, would you like to come in and add, from the program that you're running, what metrics?
Yeah, and definitely just looking at similar lines for our project as well. One key thing that perhaps I'd like to emphasize on is, and which we've seen the value in, is transparency and accountability for all the actors that are involved. Because even in project implementation, in working with communities, there are a lot of power dynamics, and you have to monitor this. You have to look at who is benefiting and who stands to benefit and what interests are being represented. So for example, when we engage with different stakeholders in scoping out some of these metrics, some are from the private sector, for example, some are business people, some have their own personal interests, and you really have to look into, okay, if an intervention is going to be implemented or is currently being implemented, how effective is it for these vulnerable groups, and whose interests are really at heart? Because once you lose sight of that, then it becomes really hazy and difficult to trace what are the effectiveness, or are we having the correct data, having the correct information? Are we using the correct approach in aiding these vulnerable communities and ensuring that their voices are heard? So I think that is one aspect that has really gone to the heart of how we conduct our monitoring and evaluation and learning. And we also have had work in informal settlements where we've seen a lot of power dynamics in terms of socioeconomic interests, but really the economic interests. And this has shaped even how we are currently implementing the Llama project, such that we want to ensure there's a proper balance. And if there's any shift, it shifts more to the needs of the vulnerable communities rather than any other power dynamics that might be involved. So that really strengthens the core of the MEL, the MEL within the project implementation cycle. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for giving a very brief and very concise strategies that you're deploying towards monitoring and evaluating these programs. And we hope if you could, I see a couple of questions in the chat box, and we'll shortly come to that. But if you could also touch on, some of the components, the digital components that you use in doing M&E, especially tracking financing to locally led adaptation initiatives at local level. That would be really insightful to the audience as well as for our own understanding. At this point, I will invite Phenny to just guide us through the next steps on how the questions in the chat box. I know there are a couple of questions as well, so feel free, audience, to ask. To you, Phenny.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you so much, panelists. What a great conversation. Very, very insightful. We have a few questions coming in. I'd encourage the participants to keep them coming in. So I'll just go through the ones that we already have and assign the panelists, and obviously feel free to chime in case you have anything to add, that is, to the panelists. So Manoj is saying that there is really limited data and information generally around on private investment in adaptation finance in Africa, and only just, with the exception of just a few cases in agriculture. So he's wondering if this kind of presents a larger challenge in mobilizing private capital for adaptation financing, and perhaps what role do we see private investment playing in climate finance. I see Tracy has given it a thumbs up, so perhaps Tracy, you could take that. Then we have Pranaj asking about, could we speak a bit more about to some successful approaches to ensure inclusivity with community decision making, so that we can mitigate risks such as elite capture, and to ensure that communities effectively involved. I really like the point, and you brought up that of effective community engagement and leadership versus community participation. So perhaps, and you could speak to that. I believe that Leah also does a lot of work related to that. So Leah, you could also chime in. The next question is specifically to Anju, so I'll let her answer it, but if Tracy and Leah also have insights, they could as well chime in. So Anju, how do you anticipate the remote sensing and GIS technologies will be able to help unlock the climate finance that's working towards 1.5 degree and net zero? How, and generally, how can it be applied in community project planning? The other question that perhaps I think touches across many of the work streams and many of the portfolios represented here is capacity building and training. I was just wondering, perhaps if the panelists could speak to the role of training and capacity building in enhancing access to climate finance, to LLA initiatives, specifically for implementation and monitoring, and perhaps how much investment is currently going into training and capacity building. So that could also be taken by the three panelists kindly. So I'll hand it over to the panelists in whichever order, and please keep the questions coming. Thank you.
Okay, let me start on the private finance. Private finance is still a touchy area for adaptation, and because of the interest, profit versus public goods, that's still a big conundrum. When we started in LifeAR and were saying we need to bring in private sector is very important. They have the money, and most of the time they are driving emissions, so they need to be part of the conversation. But most of the time we don't even include them. I've worked with governments in Africa for a number of years, but we never thought of private sector. I remember in Uganda we were working with the Meteorology Agency on a weather and climate information project. Much later is like we have tea companies and sugar companies with state-of-the-art weather equipment, and yet we are struggling with government with obsolete equipment, but we can't bring them to learn together. They have all the equipment that we need. So private sector has been left out, but also the interest of private sector for adaptation also is quite challenging. So one of the things you need to think of is the incentives. What is the incentive for private sector people to invest in adaptation where there's no profit? Most of the time they'll go for mitigation energy projects because you can sell the energy and get money. So there are those sort of challenges within private sector. Some of the governments are also wary of if we bring in private sector, what does that mean for us? If it's an investment where you may need to contribute or something. So in LifeAR, we have a mix of countries that are keen to work with private sector. Others are saying, can we first shape the initiative, make sure it's locally led, so that when private sector is coming in, we know what the deal actually is. But one of the mechanisms that was agreed was entrepreneurship and aggregation, where you have SMEs, and how do you aggregate this with the adaptation plans and NDCs. So the opportunities there, but there are also issues to think about. There's also the challenge of conducive policies and enabling environment for private sector within governments. Some of the private sectors will not respond if the operating environment is not really conducive. So governments need to think of that. But also to think of adaptation investments that will be attractive to the private sector. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Otherwise, it's not really straightforward. And from the work that has been done on blended finance, there are a number of issues that are coming up. One of them is lack of emphasis on excluded and marginalized groups by the private sector, which at the end might compromise the principles of LLA, if that is not well tackled from the private sector perspective. And also, most of the time, there's targeting for those that are either in formal employment or already entrepreneurs big, and that might leave out small entrepreneurs from less privileged groups. So there's a challenge of how do you tackle the issues of equity and inclusion within the private sector to be able to match the public good and inclusion and LLA approaches that we are taking. And some of the blended finance from the studies done are investing in big projects like improving infrastructure, access to energy, and less in adaptation, especially in development countries, which has not encouraged most of the governments to really get involved. And one of the recent reports noted that it's generally harder to mobilize commercial finance for projects that focus on adaptation and development of benefits from the private sector. So I think it's still work that is still needed to really bring private sector on board. So just on capacity building, then a handover. Capacity building is a very challenging topic. The way we've handled it, it has always been global north teaching the global south. So like there's no capacity at all. You're feeling something that is empty. That's why it has failed. And yet there are lots of capabilities within Africa, developing countries. We have assets, resources, local knowledge. But traditionally, it has been, we are teaching lack of capacity. You can't lack capacity. There's capacity. It can be strengthened or improved. So when we started Life AR, I remember went to Uganda and the PS said, if this is about capacity building, don't bother. We are tired of capacity building. So people are really getting fatigued with capacity building. The approach we are taking in Life AR is really a learning by doing approach. We are moving away from consultants from the global north. We are working with local African institutions. We have lots of universities and local institutions within country, but all our NDPs, NDCs, and NAPs have been designed by somebody from the US or some who does not understand the climate context in the country at all. So we are promoting local institutions, working with the Least Developed Country University Consortium on climate change, where universities are working with the LDC group to provide capabilities to the governments where they are. And we are not looking at training people, but working with governments alongside government to hear what they have to say, to look at the tools they're already using, then coming to teach them. So that is the approach that we are taking to really build systems and capabilities for the long term, than coming to do a training that is one-off. And that will be the same with the community groups that are involved in the implementation of the investments, really learning by doing and sharing the knowledge that is there than the traditional capacity building. Yeah.
Just quickly to add to the private sector question, right? That, as Tracy said, that is indeed a challenge because it's the private profit that's the key motivator there. And when we looked at this question, it was a few years ago, so I'm really hoping the situation's changed. But, you know, the thing that hits them is when their value chains are affected, right? And the analysis we did showed that at least multinationals, they kind of addressed the threats to their value chains insofar as, you know, it was within their country borders, but hadn't really looked at the value chains that and how they're being impacted, where they're the goods and services are coming from. So where they're heavily reliant on. So that is one thing that we're pushing, that you also need to look at your value chains in Africa and Asia, etc., to try and protect those. That's a sort of an incentive. But also they have sort of using policy, right? So for instance, the People's Adaptation Plan that we did in a port city in Bangladesh, it's a port city by which a lot of these MNCs bring in their goods. But it's terrible because you have the port, which is rich because they make all this money from this, the exports and imports. But then you have the town, which is basically an informal settlement because they get none of the taxes, none of the benefits. And so the mayor's left with dealing with providing public services to the port, whereas the Port Authority has no, or the MNCs or anybody else, local private sector has no responsibility. And there is now a new legislation in Europe for called sort of human rights due diligence, right? So we're sort of looking at options and exploring options by which we can make the case that at the end of the day, if the people in the city don't have access to basic services like water, it's part of your responsibility to address it because this is part of your value chain, right? So looking for those kind of alternatives. But I think policy and regulation also plays a key role. Unfortunately, our experience with CSR has been that they also like to keep control of where the CSR goes, right? So we're still trying to battle that. There are good examples. We in the last year's report that we published on adaptation, it's called Stories of Resilience, also on the Adaptation Hub, there was an example of how in the Philippines, which is really, really vulnerable to disasters, right? They face it, that you have these meaningful kind of interactions between the private sector, the public sector, and people, bringing that third important P in, where they all sort of decide what the priorities for the spending of those kind of resources should be. Then coming to the questions that you posed to me, Phenny, on the question of elite capture, I mean, the answer really is in the term locally led adaptation. Locally led is about leadership. Leadership is about people. And it really is about who we facilitate to become leaders in the community, right? So it has to be a very deliberate process of making sure that those leaders are the women who are often left out, the PWD representatives that are left out. So we have to sort of, it has to be a deliberate process of creating these kind of leaders and champions within the community. So for us, the people's adaptation planning process is not just about the plan. It's equally about identifying these leaders and then giving them the support that they need to, become, whether it's interaction with other communities, interactions with their governments, etc. So it really is being very deliberate. It's not an easy thing, but it's also that question of accountability that we spoke about, right? That way, if anybody feels excluded, they should have recourse to a responsive system by which they can complain, and this can be addressed. It's not just going into a black box. It's related to the question of GIS and how that helps climate financing. So GIS by itself is not going to help with climate financing, right? But what it does is that it supports community understanding of climate threats, and that makes them better spokespeople for what for support, right? So just to give you an example, I mean, this was again a learning from SDI. When we started work in Bangladesh, we had SDI representatives from Mumbai in India, which is another port city, right? Come and speak to the communities there. And to me, I mean, these benefits that are non-tangible, that really counted, was the fact that those people told them, hey, look, once you're able to identify your priorities and have really strong arguments for them, then you need to get informed how much money does your local representative, government representative get every year for development. You draw up a plan for that amount of money every year, and you go to him and say, here's what we want you to do with it, right? Then he finds it much more difficult to counter that. So it's basically empowering people with information that then sort of enables them to represent themselves better. And this has worked because now in that city, they have managed to convince the mayor to spend his annual development plan budget towards the people's adaptation plan that they've put together, right? And again, that speaks to the capacity building question, which is that at the end of the day, that's what you're trying to do. It's not even capacity building. It's sort of spotting those champions and helping them grow and giving them voice and all of that, right? So it's the way we look at the whole capacity strengthening issue is that the capacity strengthening actually has to take place from the global to the national to the local governments, even in understanding what LLA is and why it's important. So that's the capacity building piece, right? But where it comes to the communities, it's about the peer-to-peer support because they best understand what they need and what has worked in different, or similar circumstances that they can implement or not. So for us, it's more about peer-to-peer sharing this kind of sort of things that they figured out that have worked in their context, Mukuru, the big thing was, the best time to ask your government for something is just before an election, right? Because that's when they're willing to listen. So it's literally things like this that only communities will sort of understand and be able to share with each other. So that's how we look at the training and capacity building element. But also, yeah, I mean, the other thing is that for us at GCA, we work a lot with youth and with what we call adaptation jobs, right? And that's about finding those kind of skills and employment opportunities that can support capacity to make them more resilient. So to give you again a quick example, in the People's Plan, by the way, our People's Adaptation Plans comes from the People's Plan that Mukuru did, which was a broader development exercise, right? So, but the People's Plan in Mukuru had identified waste as a big issue. They built that, so the government actually did support in the building of drains, etc. But of course, very quickly they fill up, and then they're no longer effective against flood, right? So that was a big problem. And then they themselves did the research and said that 72% of this is organic waste. So we need a way to deal with this. And they identified black soldier fly farming as one of the things that they would like to do. And because it was it would help them deal with the problem of organic waste. It would be really, there's a big market for it because Kenya is drought hit. I mean, people are looking for livestock feed, which is what the larvae is used as of these flies. And the frass, the waste that they produce during the process, is a fantastic organic fertilizer, which is again sort of needed, right? So they identified this, and what our role then was to bring people who had done this in other contexts, help them build that capacity, connect them to an AFDB project that was able to fund some units. We also provided support for some units, and then provide training for young people. So 100 young people are being trained in Miramar by Miramar Foundation to do this black soldier fly farming in an urban context. So it really is also then looking for those kinds of skill building and employment opportunities that support adaptation, really. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Leah, please.
Yeah, thank you. So really great points. I can say from in terms of community engagement and how to avoid elite capture, one of the things we've routinely done is to map out the community gatekeepers, because most of the times you find these are people, they have really huge barriers to discussions, to development, to the groups you even want to talk to. So we, using the local authorities, usually take note of gatekeepers, either analyze whether it will be useful to engage them and how we can go around engaging different groups with or without them. Another aspect as we conduct our co-creation or co-learning engagements with them is to take into consideration the unique needs of every social group. So, for example, we will not start an engagement at 8 because, the women will not be available at that time, or will not end an engagement at 5 because, most of the women will not be there. Or let's say if it's the elderly, if it's persons with disabilities, you'd want a place where it's accessible, right? So that these nuances that that are easy to be overlooked, but are really key and important in ensuring that every social group, the vulnerable groups that you're targeting to bring reprieve to, the needs are attended to. Another aspect, I think, is to build their agency, which speaks to a bit to capacity. When we interact with them, when they give us information, they tell us in their local lingo, go and tell our leaders this, 1, 2, 3. But what we do is that when we have our policy labs, or when we have our other meetings with the local leaders at the county level, we invite community representatives and we tell them, no, we are not going to be speaking for you. You are going to be presenting this information to them because you better understand the context. We'll be using the information, of course, for 1, 2, 3 project purposes, but really we want to see the power dynamics shift such that you're able to usefully feed into this conversation. And we did this when we were implementing a Tomorrow Cities project in Kibera, and we're able to tell the community members, we had the women, the men, the elderly, and the youth, And they're saying, go and tell our leaders this. But we organized a dialogue session where they were able to present their visions, their participatory visions to the leaders. It was on increasing urban resilience for the urban poor. So they were able to present it on their own, and we really felt that this is the approach we are taking even in implementing the Llama project, such that when we go to them, we are not we don't want to behave as if we are conduits of information to pass to these high level people, but we want to involve them not just as participatory, but them taking charge and speaking to their leaders so that their agency is built. They're more confident when they talk about adaptation financing, for example. They're even able to explain it in their own local lingo. They know the dynamics, the power dynamics that are involved, and the interventions that would better feed into their future or make their lives better as community members. So we are reducing that aspect of being conduits of information to these high level people and letting the community take charge and leadership. And we've seen it work in our project. So yeah, thank you.
Amazing. Thank you all so much. I have 3 more questions, and in the interest of time, I'd like to assign each of the panelists 1 question. So I'll go first with Greg's question. So this I'll give it to Anju. Greg is asking, how can women groups such as Chamas, so Chamas are kind of informal savings societies, savings and lending societies. How can Chamas be integrated into LLA, and can digitization play a role in that integration? So Anju, please answer that. And the question that, the second question will go to Leah. Are there any good examples of measuring the success of climate literacy programs within communities? Please take that, Leah. And the final question, I'll direct it to Tracy. How can financial institutions and development partners effectively balance the need for rigorous financial accountability and the flexibility required to support innovative, community-driven adaptation projects, especially in regions with limited financial infrastructure and capacity? What frameworks and tools can be implemented to ensure financial integrity and adaptability in this context?
Thanks, Phenny. So yeah, to very quickly answer that question, so LLA is not really a program, right? It's a process. It's something that we're trying to do, but one of the findings we had, what the first challenge is, how do you bring a community together? How do you get them interested? I mean, most of the communities, they don't have the time for this. Climate change, you're talking to us about something in the future. It's not something here and now. So what for our experience has been is that these saving groups are often the first way to bring together a community, right? So where you already have them, you have a fantastic platform to get them talking about climate change and adaptation, etc. So it's literally a fantastic first step to begin that conversation on how climate change is going to impact them in the long term. So I think it really is the question of finding those opportunities to be able to do that.
Amazing. Thank you. Leah, please.
Yes, thanks. So in terms of climate literacy, I can say, again, it's not something that happens in a day, not even in a month, not even within a project period. But what we emphasize on is learning by doing. So we strengthen their capacity to be able to relate with some of these aspects, project objectives, to be able to give their feedback. And once we see, or once they're able to interact with us, when you conduct a discussion and your participants are really understanding and they have thorough discussions of say project objectives or what they expect or how the project is being implemented, etc., that then they're becoming more literate on that subject. But I can say it's something that stretches even beyond that project implementation period, and we are only able to track this as they interact with these subjects, as they interact, for example, in their climate change committee wards, ward committees, for example. So when they impart that information, peer-to-peer learning, when they impart that information amongst themselves and even with other community members, when they engage with the county government on matters of climate change and what adaptation interventions would work in that context, then you're able to see that progress has been made in them better understanding the subject. Thank you.
Fantastic. Tracy.
Thanks, Phenny. The question on balancing rigorous financial accountability and innovation is a power dynamic, is how I would summarize it. Because it's very challenging if there's no flexibility for LLA to happen, that's for sure. And from LifeAR perspective, that's one of the challenges LDC group recognized from the start. So you have to set the rules, but most of the time communities forget the power that they have in terms of setting the rules. We think that those with the money should set all the rules, and that's where the problem is. So work on advocacy and influencing reforms in finance providers is really important. The way we've set up this initiative is that, like I mentioned before, it was a partnership-based, principle-based partnership, 5 principles of equity, working together on the same platform, being clear on what we want to shift. We run a pooled fund. We have refused donors requesting for, if you have 10 donors and each one wants a report in a different format, difficult. You'll never do anything. You'll be reporting and doing a different mail system. So the rules have been set by the LDC group. We run a pooled fund. If you don't want a pooled fund, then you're not the funder that we need because we're doing something different. So it's challenging. We've refused money from some of the funders, which is difficult, but some things have to be done. So I think communities need to learn to set the rules, and it will change with time. We need to work on that. There's a lot of work going on in terms of shifting power, even by philanthropies and CSOs. I'll give a very good example, Climate Justice Resilience Fund. Out of these voices and communities pushing back and organizations pushing back are moving to a participatory granting mechanism. They've reshuffled their board. Their board now is led by Indigenous people and community group leaders who have replaced the big powers in the US, which is really, really transformative. They are now doing a participatory granting mechanism where they invite Indigenous people, CSOs, to assess their applications because they understand the issues on the ground. So there are some of these mechanisms and tools that are working, but what I would say is that there's need to really push from community groups, so movement, coalitions, and working together to address some of the issues that are hindering these processes is still work that we need to do. Thank you.
Amazing. Well, it's been such an honor facilitating this Q&A session and really learning a lot from the panelists and from the audience. So I'll hand it back to Brian. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that Q&A, and thank you, audience, for such wonderful questions. And thankfully, I was not in the panel, but they've been able to address the questions correctly and giving great insight on how we can, unlock the potential. So just to bring us to the end of this session, we will take a few seconds just to summarize the key takeaways. And what I'm understanding is that the first thing is the needs of the communities, understanding the needs from the point of uniqueness of different social groups, coming out very clearly right from the beginning of the introduction. And then the second thing is developing people adaptation plan, or a plan that is oriented around people's participation, which is even iterated in the last, when Tracy is mentioning how different boards are changing and so forth. This is really critical in LLA for it to be successful. The third thing is adaptation finance is still limited, but yes, it's not the only problem. It's not the only challenge that we have. And the power of digital, solutions can come to address this. Then the fourth one, of course, that the digital resources that can be harnessed to bridge into this gap. And then lastly, monitoring and evaluation should be accountable, transparent, and as well as, involving the people at grassroots or the people that are affected. That is the key takeaway. I will now take this session to have a call to action, probably for each of the panelists to just mention a call to action in terms of the way forward with LLA and how finance and tech would be important in a minute or so. Then we wrap up and close the webinar. Thank you. Probably from you, Anju. and then Tracy, then Leah.
Thanks, Brian. So I'm going to echo Tracy's thoughts. And, I think that we are struggling with a very fundamental problem here in climate finance, right? And that problem is that climate finance is using the mechanisms of official development assistance, aid, basically, which is like that system was decided from, the mechanisms of that system were based on sort of its accountability to the taxpayer in that country, right? That was what this system was built for. Now, what we have to say and push back is that we are talking about accountability to the communities that are being affected. And this needs a fundamental change. We can't keep on using these outdated systems of ODA for climate finance. So till we make that very fundamental sort of differentiation, the ministries of finance in the rich countries are going to continue to treat this like something that is optional. It's not optional, it's owed to the communities that have been impacted. So I think that this is one very fundamental change that we need, this recognition that this is not out of the goodness of your heart. It is because you have caused damage and you need to compensate. So and that's why we struggle with sort of trying to get these fundamental things into place. So I'll stop with that. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Brian. I think I'll say that we need to work in business unusual ways. The time for business as usual is gone. And also to note that LLA, by saying LLA, is not going to increase adaptation finance, that's for sure. I know everybody loves LLA, but it doesn't mean it is going to increase adaptation finance. We need to address the systemic issues that are hindering climate finance getting to the local level by working in different ways, changing systems, capabilities, challenging power dynamics to enable LLA to take place. So let's not do the LLA whitewashing, but let's actually do the work to change how systems are working. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's quite interesting. LLA whitewashing. We need to strategically think about when you talk about locally led adaptation financing, what is this money going to do for our communities? Because most times we want the money, but we do not have the structures, or we do not have the clear plan of what it is going to do for our local communities. And that has been our experience, where the local policy makers at the county level are telling us, please implement this project as soon as you can, so that we know how can this money help the vulnerable people? How can we be sure that the social groups, it is a needs-driven project, or it's a needs-driven financing mechanism or financing arrangement? So really there's a crucial need for us to know this financing that we clamor for and will continue clamoring for, how is it going to assist the most vulnerable people within our communities? And until we get that right, I think we might have the money, but the efficacy in implementing these interventions will still be in question. So that's it for me. And really, thank you to the rest of my panelists. I have truly learned a lot and looking forward to future engagements. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for creating time. And first of all, I'd like to thank the participants who have been able to join this session for this conversation to continue and listening carefully to different contributions. And also thank you very much for our teams who have also taken part to organize this session. And then lastly, thank you, Tracy, for your contributions, as well as joining this session and contributing actively. These are very insightful. Thank you as well, Anju, and thank you as well, Leah. We thought this was useful, and if you have any questions, please, you could put them in the chat box. We will share them with the panelists later and provide these responses to you. Thank you, and yeah, this marks the end of our webinar today.